Our second speaker for this session is John Will Rice. John Will is a PhD student working between Heidelberg and Tel Aviv. And his PhD dissertation is on images of the cobra, the Egyptian cobra in the Levant. And the topic of his seminar today will be on related questions of Egyptianizing, kind of iconography and uses of Egyptian script in the southern Levant, so outside of what we might consider the Egyptian heartland.
Okay. First things first, I'm going to assume that by and large, like the history of the southern Levant is kind of foreign territory for most people in this room. So this is going to have to be a little bit of a crash course on what's going on for a millennium and a half in the southern Levant, and then I'm going to try and interweave a little bit of what's going on with pseudo hieroglyphs in it, and sort of the way that they seem to be relating themselves to Egypt. A couple introductory notes, and these are kind of laid out on the handout as far as the dates go. I'm going to start in the Middle Bronze Age, which is roughly the first half of the second millennium BCE. Then the Late Bronze Age is roughly the second half of the Middle Bronze is first half, Late Bronze is second half of the second millennium BC, and then the Iron Age is basically the first half of the first millennium. The Late Bronze Age was generally a time of Egyptian rule in the Levant. And so I'm going to speak a little bit about it, but what I mostly want to talk about here is the Middle Bronze Age, and then sort of skip over this direct Egyptian rule time and go back to where there's maybe not as direct political connections between the regions. There's been a lot of debate surrounding all of the exact transition dates between the periods, so that just think first and second halves is probably the easiest way to do that. In any case, the numbers I'm using on the handouts come from the most recently recalibrated radiocarbon dates, if anybody cares. Secondly, in terms of sort of terminology, when I talk about the southern Levant, that's mostly going to be the area of modern, like Israel, Palestine, and Jordan, with sometimes you get the Sinai Peninsula added in that, and then also like southern Lebanon and Syria up to like Sidon and Damascus can kind of be as part of this larger region. And then I'm going to differentiate that between like using Palestine in a sort of historical regional sense to refer to the current sort of area of the modern state of Israel and the Palestinian territories. So kind of southern Levant can kind of be a bigger umbrella term, whereas most of what I'm going to be talking about is in the area of historical Palestine. So here, basically the heartland. In the Late Bronze Age, this whole thing can be called Canaan, but then things get complicated in the Iron Age because it's not called Canaan anymore. We have Israel up in the north, which is not like the Israel of the Bible. Or the state of Israel. Israel, in a political sense, in the Iron Age, is specifically a kingdom ruled from up here, Samaria. And this is something distinct from the kingdom of Judah in the south, which is ruled from Jerusalem. So to just kind of bypass all of these annoying differentiations, I'm going to stick to Palestine for the region. So let's start in the Middle Bronze Age. Specifically the latter phases of the Middle Bronze Age, the Middle Bronze 2 and 3. Again, nice iffy radiocarbon dates there. During these periods, Levantines begin settling in Egypt in the Eastern Nile Delta, culminating with the establishment in Egypt of the foreign Levantine 15th so-called like Hyksos dynasty. So we're at a time of close cultural interaction between Egypt and the Levant, alongside attestations of actual hieroglyphic writing in this period. We also see the emergence of syllabic and alphabetic writing systems that are related to the hieroglyphic writing system. But what I'm most interested in here is the way that, kind of for their own non-textual purposes, local Southern Levantines adapted, and I'll say experienced hieroglyphic signs. So I'm going to focus mostly on scarab amulets. And here I'm drawing heavily on a few publications by Daphne Bentor from the Israel Museum. The story obviously starts in Egypt. Scarab amulets begin being mass produced in Egypt in the early second millennium BCE in the late Middle Kingdom period. These amulets become popular in Egypt as funerary objects, as objects placed in tombs with people when they die. The flat bottom part of the scarab would be inscribed, as you can see here. This is actually a series of Egyptian examples predating all of the Palestinian scarabs. And these have the names of the private persons that they were buried with, and along with presumably depictions of the people, almost like headstones, kind of. But this isn't the only thing they look like. The variety of artistic designs is pretty wide. Most were either royal symbols or like protective good luck symbols. And it's important to note here that as part of this, even in the Egyptian scarabs, hieroglyph signs are used in ways that are clearly not meant to represent like a text. Oftentimes the hieroglyphs were chosen for other symbolic reasons, and I'll get to some of these in a little bit. But in any case, because these are mainly funerary objects, the images on the bottom, hieroglyphs included, they were probably mostly intended for apotropaic, sort of magical, protective purposes. But these scarabs eventually make their way into the Levant, and not long thereafter, they begin being mass produced there as well. In Palestine, and I can't really speak to the northern Levant, most of these scarabs have been found in tombs or other burial contexts. So it seems that, like in Egypt, their popularity in the Levant, or the southern Levant, was related to their use as funerary objects. When local Palestinian production of scarab amulets starts, the iconographic repertoire is drawing on these earlier Egyptian examples. But the motifs and signs are used in different ways a lot of times, and then they get mixed in with other sort of Levantine motifs. So turning to the Southern Levantine use of hieroglyphs in particular, there are a few things that can be said, and just as a heads up, I'm about to just throw scarab pictures at you. These all come from the newly launched corpus of stamp seals from the Southern Levant database, which is really cool. It was just it's from a project from Zurich, Bern, and Tel Aviv through the Swiss National Science Foundation. It launched like a year ago. They're still kind of updating it. It's awesome. I have way too much fun on it, but also like, I don't know, boring things excite me. There develops an idiosyncratic way of rendering certain hieroglyphs. And I put examples of local developments on the handout, and you can kind of, I don't know, peruse those at your leisure. I want to go through and kind of talk a little bit about the symbolism of these more than how they're actually sort of changing when they get to the Levant. As Ken has already mentioned, the papyrus stem is it's a symbol associated with Lower Egypt, so around the area of the Egyptian Delta, and this is kind of where all of the Levantines are settling in Egypt. It's the closest place to the Levant, so it's not necessarily surprising that we would find this in the Levantine scarabs. There we go. Okay, another one here is the ma'at feather. I think the Egyptologists in the room could correct me, but that's supposed to be as a ma'at feather. It's an ostrich feather.
Yeah, it's an ostrich feather.
It kind of winds up looking a little bit like a hat here. Do y'all find the ma'at feathers on top of UKRI in Egypt?
Ma'at herself.
But on the UKRI?
So yeah.
Okay. So it's not a local development. Okay, good to know. But either way, you can sort of see how they're not exactly looking like feathers here, and it kind of, there's changes. But Ma'at, is like this Egyptian sense of like cosmic order, truth, justice, stuff that maybe you would expect to find in burial contexts. Okay, this next one is, the sign is a board game. But it's the min translates to like to remain or to endure, so also appropriate for a funerary context. It also is a major element of the name of the god Amun, which then becomes popular in later periods as well. So it starts showing up in several different contexts. Is this gonna work? No, it's not. The battery sign is blinking. Okay. And then here's another one, the Ka, which the Ka is like the part of the soul that the living people have, but dead people don't. And it's two upraised hands. You can see little head there. That gets sort of added, but is apparently existed in Old Kingdom examples in Egypt. I was told shortly before this this all started. Yeah, so again, like all of these, and you can go ahead and skip to okay, yeah, I'll do this one too. This one's interesting because we're not entirely sure what this is. There has been the thought that this is a sun disk, and then you have two cobras. Oh, I can tap it and do it. Does that work?
Clever coach.
Okay, well, I'll just do this then. Nice, okay. There has been the suggestion that these are two cobras that are kind of on either side of the sun disk protecting it. But it's probably more likely the Achet symbol, which is like the rising sun in the morning. And this fits with the scarab context because it's associated with resurrection, rebirth, and this is also kind of the domain of the scarab-headed god Khepri. So all of these are kind of all mixing together. I'm going to skip over this one. Oh, it's not there. Okay, cool. So those are some of the symbolic hieroglyph signs we have. There's some other cool stuff going on, and if y'all will bear with me, just getting through two more weird localizations here. This is the glottal ayin, and it's an arm. Sometimes it seems to be like used as like a protection symbol. You have it here with an animal. Well, yeah, it's not always the tail, and they do this with the snakes too. Like sometimes they'll put them up here, and then eventually both the snakes and the arm then get kind of melded into the tail. But so this one, the ayin, and then here's the water hieroglyph that then gets sort of localized in several different ways. And these are important because these are two of the three signs in the ever perplexing ANRA formula. So, this is kind of the standard ayin in our ayin, but it shows up in all sorts of like combinations, permutations, whatever you want. You can kind of see over here, they put them all together in lots of different ways. They mix them with other pseudo hieroglyphs. The main thought, I think, seems to be that there's some sort of association with Ra here, because the last two elements in the Anra are Ra. There's also been another suggestion that because there's no L, like L, in the hieroglyphs, and because sometimes the Semitic L is rendered with N and R together, that this might be representing an L, in which case this might read El, Elu, which was, so El is the name of it both means a god in West Semitic, but also it's the head god of the West Semitic pantheon. So maybe something with Ra, maybe something with El, nobody really knows. It shows up everywhere. It's very important for some reason, and yeah. Here's another one. This one's important because, so here's the hieroglyphic writing for the name of Ta, and it shows up accurately in some scarabs. but then it also it gets mixed around. And so they're not writing it correctly all the time. Some of the signs get flipped. And so this is actually one of the main reasons why people have said, okay, maybe they don't actually like maybe the people that are producing these don't actually understand hieroglyphs. Maybe they're just experiencing this entirely as a visual phenomenon, without an understanding of the underlying system. That's probably correct, but I do also wonder if we can separate, and maybe if there's a way of thinking, not necessarily ignorance, and maybe more just, we don't care, we're doing something different with them. I don't know. This one, I'm not gonna get into that, it's stressful. Okay, but the interesting thing is that all of these localized signs and developments that are going on in Palestine, once the Egyptian scarabs get to Palestine, they then make their way back into the Egyptian-made scarabs. So this isn't just a unidirectional, unilateral sort of, dumping of culture from the center to the periphery. Things are going both ways. And it's probably because at this time you have lots of Levantines settling in the Nile Delta, and there's just lots of cultural contacts, and everything gets sort of mixed in together. But these then kind of wind up back in the Egyptian repertoire, and they continue on for, into the New Kingdom late period, right? Like these don't really leave the Egyptian, I don't think, the Egyptian sort of set of motifs. So that's kind of the interesting stuff from the Middle Bronze Age. Once we get to the Late Bronze Age, there's like a manor village system that's functioning in the Middle Bronze Age that collapses, that marks the transition to the Late Bronze Age for anybody archaeologically inclined. But we mainly judge define the Late Bronze Age as the time of Egyptian rule in the Levant. So you have in the southern Levant at this time several sort of city-states that are functioning all kind of through here, with 3 Egyptian centers mainly, from which they're kind of ruling. And it's not clear how direct the Egyptians were ruling at this time. Whether you kind of consider it like a colonialist or imperialist structures kind of debated right now. But in any case, you have Gaza and Jaffa as Egyptian political centers, and then Bet Shan up in the north is a military garrison with some really cool stuff out of it. I think more Egyptian stuff has been found at Bet Shan than anywhere else outside of Egypt, if I'm remembering that correctly. And the only exception to that would be Gaza, if that tell exists anymore. But here is basically empty, except for Shechem, which is modern Nablus, and Jerusalem. In terms of writing systems, you have Akkadian that's being used to communicate with Egypt. There's hieroglyphic writing. Hieratic makes its way here alongside the alphabetic Proto-Canaanite script. Hey, it's working again. Nice. So this one's really cool. This is from Bet Shan. This is a stela of an Egyptian official worshiping the local Canaanite god of Bet Shan. And it's hieroglyphic writing, but we've got the Canaanite god in it. And then have a bowl with a hieratic sort of inscription on it. And then this is one of the Akkadian tablets that then gets shipped to Egypt, as they're using Akkadian to communicate with Pharaoh. So despite the strong international connections tangible in the material record, the LB was not a stable period in the southern Levant. It was largely a period of deurbanization and socio-political disintegration. And so then eventually, because of problems back home, New Kingdom Egypt withdraws from the southern Levant around 1130. And this is this end of Egyptian rule marks the end of the Late Bronze Age. So now to the Iron Age. The withdrawal of New Kingdom Egypt and the collapse of the larger international system of the late Bronze Eastern Mediterranean brought to an end many of the scribal systems that are attested in the southern Levant in the late Bronze Age. Knowledge of both Egyptian and Akkadian seems to cease, with only early alphabetic sort of spanning the transition. Egyptian and Egyptianizing goods and iconography generally decline in popularity in the early Iron Age. I mean, the Egyptians are gone. And this coincides with a resurgence of local autochthonous iconography. In the late Bronze Age, scarabs bearing pharaonic iconography or inscribed with names of pharaohs are quite popular, and they basically disappear after Egyptian withdrawal. This lack of productive local engagement with Egyptian motifs in the early Iron Age resulted in the larger sort of Egyptian iconographic repertoire, if we can sort of say that, being largely the same in this period between Egypt and the Levant. So the Levantines aren't really doing much with Egyptian iconography in this period, so all of the main driving forces come from Egypt. In other words, because the Levantines aren't interacting as much with Egyptian style iconography, what's going on in Egypt is basically it, developmentally speaking. I'm going to skip over this for time purposes. Maybe this one too, but just note that in the early Iron Age, we do still have Egyptian looking stuff being produced or consumed. These were actually produced in the Nile Delta probably. They're still being consumed, but they don't look as like offensively Egyptian. Like the this was a pharaoh, but doesn't really look like a pharaoh anymore. Then you kind of get later and you do start to see other kinds of Egyptian iconography being used. The cartouche here, which is the circle that they put around the royal names. I'll go back to the. Yeah, you see it a lot with this UNRWA formula. They're putting in the cartouches. You see lots of stuff getting put in cartouches here, but it's not the UNRWA formula. It's other pseudo hieroglyphic designs that seem to go back to late Bronze Age models. I could talk for half an hour on this one. This one's fascinating. Does anybody else? Does that? Oh yes, yes, it's a hieroglyph, but it also looks. Yeah. This looks cuneiform, yeah. But it's also probably the main it's the main element in Sheshonq. And which is, if I had time, I might talk a little bit about that. I will. In any case, once we get kind of into the middle of the Iron Age, when the kingdoms of Israel and Judah are, say, internationally relevant, like somewhat of regional powers, at this time you also see a resurgence in Egyptian and Egyptianizing iconography. Israelite and Judahite kings are adopting Egyptian iconography in their palace decorations, and also in like what is effectively administrative logos. And clearly Egyptian iconography makes a comeback in locally produced seals as well. There are, I think, both short-term and long-term reasons for this. By this point, ties between Egypt and the southern Levant had been reestablished under the 22nd dynasty. And you see in some aspects that motifs popular in 22nd dynasty Egypt are also popular in the southern Levant. At the same time, other aspects of this Egyptianizing Renaissance are tied to trends observable in Palestine in the Middle and Late Bronze Ages. So again, we're at a place that's difficult to untangle long-term versus short-term cultural contact. But, and this is an important point where I want to go with this, the coinciding of the return of long-established motifs alongside those popular in contemporary Egypt seems to me to indicate that the locals, they at least recognized that all of this was in some way Egyptian. In other words, the millennium of localization of these symbols and motifs did not fully strip away their perceivability as something Egyptian to the locals, even when the locals are the ones producing this. I don't have time to get into the details of some of the fun stuff going on in all these Iron Age seals or scarabs. But just to note a few things, MB and LB scarabs have been found in Iron Age and later, sometimes much later, archaeological contexts. And then the Iron 2B, within this Egyptianizing Renaissance, you see there's local reproduction of the Middle Bronze style scarabs, including all of the hieroglyphic stuff from the Middle Bronze Age that I covered at the beginning. So these developments are not just something that stays in the early second millennium. They shape Levantine self-expression for centuries and centuries thereafter. These are ones found in later. There's Middle Bronze found in Iron Age context. These are Iron Age scarabs and seals that are imitating Middle Bronze style. But I want to backtrack to the transition from the Late Bronze Age to the Iron Age. Because in the Late Bronze Age, the highlands were basically devoid of settlement. I'm talking about, you can see kind of topographically the highlands here. These were basically devoid of settlement except for these two ruling centers. One in the north and one in the south. What we see in the early Iron Age is a massive wave of settlement across the highlands, traditionally associated with the arrival of the Israelites from Egypt, which then, by the 9th century, coalesces into the core of two much stronger territorial kingdoms, more or less coinciding with the population centers of the LB. The Kingdom of Israel is ruled from the newly founded capital in Samaria, not far from Shechem, while the Kingdom of Judah is ruled from Jerusalem. Around this time, we start to see clear signs of the revival of a centralized bureaucratic scribal system. It's here in the 9th century that indigenous monumental inscriptions begin being produced, and now in the vernacular West Semitic language and script. Also, the earliest records preserved in the biblical book of Kings appear to date at this time and no earlier, the 9th century. Nothing in all of this, or in all of the writings that appear in the centuries that follow, seem to know of the time of Egyptian hegemony in the Late Bronze Age. The collapse of the Late Bronze Age resulted in a long-term break in the region's awareness of its own past. Now, one of the more interesting developments in Southern Levantine archaeology in recent decades, and its move away from biblical archaeology, has been the recognition that, despite what is narrated in the Hebrew Bible, the Israelites did not actually come out of Egypt. They were, by and large, the same peoples as the Canaanites, who, according to the Bible, were the previous inhabitants of the land before the Israelite conquest. But this equation of the two peoples and the placement of the origins of the Israelites in the Levant rather than Egypt then naturally raises the question of where the idea of an exodus from Egypt could have come from. There have been many suggestions for how to solve this problem. The most convincing in my eyes is that this out of Egypt tradition somehow preserves the memory of the Late Bronze Age, the second half of the second millennium, when New Kingdom Egypt ruled over Canaan and its people. The same people who would later in the Iron Age become known as the Israelites. But what's been lacking in the discussion, don't have to read that if you don't want to, is like a plausible explanation for how exactly this would have happened. I think the most plausible is an iconographic solution that's been proposed. Ron Hendel looked at some iconography from Egypt of like the subjugation of Asiatics and said, yes, okay, this is how the memory of Late Bronze rule was sort of preserved. But it's not clear to me because all of his examples come from Egypt, and what's not clear to me is how then this would have made its way back to the Levant in such a strong way that it sort of sets the foundation for an entire national myth that becomes the the Exodus story. So one of the things I'm proposing in my dissertation is a process by which the remnants of the cultural connections to Egypt from the 2nd millennium BCE were the basis for the emergence of an out from Egypt or Exodus tradition during the 1st millennium that then became preserved and expanded in the writings of the Hebrew Bible. This was, I believe, primarily a visual phenomenon. Levantines of the 1st millennium BCE saw all around them the remnants and heritage of the Levant's manifold intimate connections with Egypt from the 2nd millennium. The idea is such Egyptian or Egyptianizing objects, whether ivories from the Israelite palace in Samaria, bearing images of Egyptian cobras, or the pharaoh smiting his enemies, it's the broken one up top, or scarabs with hieroglyphic, pseudo-hieroglyphic, and all other kinds of Egyptian motifs. These were found in the tombs of their ancestors or dug up when they went to set the foundations of their houses. These objects from or reflecting their past, anchored within the ancient Palestinian collective memory, the close ties with Egypt throughout the 2nd millennium, even though the scribal system of the Late Bronze Age, which would have otherwise preserved the actual historical circumstances of these ties, collapsed. Since there were no texts available to carry the actual historical narrative from one generation to the next, local Israelites drew from this tangible visual culture conclusions about their own past that deviated from the historical realities. Does that make sense? So the cultural and political influence of Egyptians in the Levant, still perceivable centuries after New Kingdom withdrawal, led to a national narrative in which the geographic circumstances were reversed. With the Levantines still having been under Egyptian rule, but now in Egypt rather than at home. Egyptian rule in the Levant in the Late Bronze Age was turned on its head, so that in the Iron Age, the Israelites perceived their long-term connections with the Nile River Valley, but because their interaction with this distant past was primarily visual, there was no immediate explanation for how these connections came about. So instead of pharaonic rule in the Levant, they spoke instead of, the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt. And this, I think, how do I say this? I'm fascinated by this because you can take all of these tiny little bits, whether it's the development of the pseudo-hieroglyphs in the Middle Bronze Age, or the fact that the Israelite kings decided to, adorn their couches with pictures of the pharaoh. Like, all of these things are kind of coalescing together into this place looks way more Egyptian than it probably should be for people who don't remember the Egyptian rule in the Late Bronze Age and the connections between the Delta and the Levant in the Middle Bronze Age. So just to kind of go back here to the pseudo-hieroglyphs, like this is, I think, an important sort of piece of the puzzle, even though it's not the entire story. So yeah, appreciate y'all's attention and look forward to this discussion.